Recording in progress. There we go. So today is part 2 of lighting. So for today, we will be using multiple lights. We've got a still life, which you guys will be doing, or the Cornell rabbit, Cornell University, one of the first point cloud scans done. And then we've also got a portrait. We've got a point cloud head scan with a skin texture on it, so that if you put a light behind the ear, you will get that subsurface scattering effect that we get when you shine a light through skin or soft tissue. The light will penetrate it, spread out, penetrate it more, spread out. That's why when you put a flashlight up to your hand, it kind of looks red as it passes through all the blood vessels and the soft tissue. So you'll get a chance to practice multiple lights with a couple of assignments. So Discord next week, I'll be on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Don't forget, Thursdays, we have our campus and online optional open lab. And don't forget, Monday is a Labor Day holiday for us. So Full Sail is not open. And normally your stuff would be due on Sunday, but since we don't have class Monday, I pushed the deadline to Tuesday for Project 3. You're welcome. So you guys get some extra time. You won't have anything due over the holiday, but get as much done as you can in lab. You know, that way we can troubleshoot problems if there are any. Because don't want you guys getting stuck. All right. So don't forget, term ID for all the assignments is 2021_09. Don't forget, uppercase, lowercase makes a huge difference. An uppercase letter is read as a different, I'm going to use the term word, in coding and scripting than a lowercase letter. They are completely different characters. So if your client or customer or boss asks for a specific naming, usually it means they're, unless they specify all lowercase, it usually means whatever they give you is probably going to be the naming, upper and lower. So all deliverable information is good in FSO, so please make sure you review all of that. Make sure that all your renders are snapped into the template. Make sure that you've read the directions. If you're using Maya 2022, just be aware that it turns off color management. So when I open the scenes up to look at them, color management is turned off. That's why we don't recommend using Maya 2022 yet. All right, don't forget, stay 3 feet apart. Please wear a mask all the time in any indoor environments at Full Sail, especially in class. We're trying to keep everybody safe. Give your station a spray down. Don't forget, there's alcohol bottles up front here. When you're done, when you leave, give it another spray down. If you're sick, do not come to campus. Send me a message, send me an email. You know, that is perfectly acceptable for you to go and do it from home if you are able. That would definitely be a big exception. So no problem with that. No headphones, earbuds during lecture, please. You can do it during lab to get into the zone or whatever you want to do. Oh yeah, put the phones on silent. I just have to remind myself. That's mostly why I have it there. All right, so today, mostly soft light. Soft light is very crucial to creating realistic looking photos, renders, environments. It's that natural light that we see, mostly produced by bounce light or indirect light. We're going to be working with multiple lights. We're also going to be utilizing something called light linking. It lets us link specific lights to specific objects if we need to. We're going to be doing some image analysis. We've got a portrait guide that you guys are going to look at, and we're going to go over it together. The portrait guide is one of the resources for today that you'll be using. You guys will pick one of the portraits in the guide. There's 24 examples, and you will pick one that's got at least 2 lights in it to use for your portrait today. We're going to talk about, how the photographer's got it set up. There's a little diagram next to each portrait that kind of gives us an idea of where the lighting is. We'll talk about the lights that were used, the position, some of the terminology, and how we relate that to CG or Maya, computer graphics. And as always, we're going to be dealing with the principles of light. Light direction is key. That's the first thing. How bright is it? Is there color? And then the shadow quality. Got any questions? Comments? Okay. All right. So I've got 2 images here that I took. One on the left, I used what's called a soft light. And the one on the right, I used a hard light. Now, in reality, it's the same light. It's the one that's a little softer, has what's called a hood over it. It's called a softbox. So let's talk a little bit about that. So this image right here, we shot in our office. And this is kind of the layout we used. So we have spotlights. Spotlight here. There's another one on the other side. And there's one down here. All right, now, the spotlight above that is to the side of the still life has that soft box hood on it. It's basically an attachment you put on in front of the spotlight. It's got a diffuser in the front, which allows light to come through. Notice the sides of the hood are black, so it funnels most, if not all, of the light out the front. Some of it leaks out the back, but that's not a big deal usually. It sends the light out the front. That diffuser breaks up that spotlight. That spotlight is what we call a direct light, because we get a light pattern that is conical, shaped on that cone, that kind of spreads out a little bit from the base. But the rays are fairly organized when they come out. They don't diffuse too much. They do spread, but they don't diffuse. We send them through this hood. And that, in turn, diffuses the light. Goes all over the place. Comes out very, very, very diffused to the point of creating nice, really, really nice soft shadows. All right, so this example right here. Same light position, same camera settings, same exposure in the camera. Like I said, same light position. So consequently, it's going to have the same intensity. The only difference is that hood in front of it. So there's a couple of things other than just that soft shadow that we get. Let me kind of zoom in on this a little bit better and see if we can kind of pick out what's going on. All right, so here is our soft light. You can see the shadow is the same, or same position, I should say, much softer. Over here, shadow is a lot more contracted, a lot more organized, a lot harder. But besides that, what else do you notice between the two objects? Say again? Image is a lot sharper on the right. All right. You know, I'm looking at the tag that still is in focus. That really hasn't changed all that much. So what do you mean by sharper? Ah, that's good. Yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for. Let me zoom back out, fit slide. So notice that the harder light, since it is more organized, it creates a lot of very small little shadows across the top of this drive. And this is the kind of picture you'd see in Etsy or, you know, a product catalog. You're trying to sell something. So that hard light produces a lot more detail. It gets into those little nooks and crannies, the little, you know, kind of very rough surface. Zoom in even more. All right, so you can see the drive has a texture to the top of it. If you were to, you know, rub your hand over it, it would feel sort of grainy and sandy. And that's exactly what that hard light is picking up. It's picking up all that little bit of detail. And notice here, it's much more minimized. Those scattered light rays, that soft light kind of surrounds the drive a lot more, creates a blanket on it, so it minimizes that detail. And that's something you want to keep in mind when you're working and trying to light something. Do you want to minimize detail, or do you want to maximize detail? Now, if you've got a modeler who spent a lot of time modeling little cracks and little imperfections, you're probably going to want to show all that detail using a hard light. Maybe not a super hard light, but definitely a light that's going to be a lot harder, because you don't want to minimize all that detail. All right, does that make sense? Questions? So a lot of times this is used in advertising. So anybody ever see those proactive commercials for skincare, right? They usually show you somebody before, and they usually have a really shiny face, and they usually have a bunch of hard lights, like spotlights, all around them, so they can show all the detail, every pore, every imperfection on the face. And then they go, after 2 weeks, my face took a magical transformation. And then all of a sudden they have, you know, makeup on and soft light all around them, and it helps to minimize all those imperfections. So does the product work, or is it just really good advertising? You know, it's probably a little bit of both, but based on what your client's need is, that's what you need to supply. You need to emphasize what they want. Nathaniel, keep your mask up. All right, questions, comments? Make sense? All right, so soft lighting, we talked about hard lighting with film noir. And that's basically what it is. You know, they do use soft lighting once in a while, but film noir is all about that stark contrast between light and shadow. Now, when you're trying to create an environment where you don't necessarily want the lighting in the foreground, you know, right in your face, you want it to just kind of play in with the story, that's when you're going to use softer light. And really, you know, if you're looking for a couple of words to describe soft light to somebody, it's just a very soft gradient or transition between light and dark. Whereas hard light is a much more abrupt transition, where you've got light, maybe you got a little fuzzy area in the middle, and then you've got shadow. Whereas with soft light, you've got light and it starts to fade into shadow, depending on how soft it is. Sometimes it makes it very hard to see where it's coming from. In that case, there's always going to be a key light somewhere. So that's your primary. And then that soft light is probably just all around the subject to make it look natural. So until we started getting global illumination and a way to calculate bounce light, we had a lot of trouble trying to create really realistic environments because there's always a lot of soft light around. So you can see we got a couple examples here of some of the earlier global illumination or soft lighting that we've implemented. And global illumination started way back in the late 1990s, but it really didn't become usable and controllable until like 2002, 2003. Then it started to be used and eventually brought into mainstream films, at least CG films. All right, so for you guys, we have a couple of resources. The first one is called the lighting compass. So the lighting compass, you can basically right-click and take the image from here. There's also the link to the reading for it. And the reading part is actually pretty good. They talk about why we need the lighting compass. But it's really just kind of a common sense guide to let you know where the light direction comes from. And remember, every time that we create a render, it's always a relationship between camera, which is you looking into the computer, and the subject. What is the camera aimed at? What do you want to record or capture? So everything else is based around that relationship. Where's your key light? Where's your fill light, if there is one? Where's the backlight? Where's the rim light? Where's the top light? Where's, you know, it's all based on that relationship of camera subject. So some common terminology. This doesn't deal with elevation, meaning how high or low the light is in the scene. But it's really got to do with the direction of the light in 360 degrees as if we were looking down. So how high up the light is, we'll talk about that and how we calculate and how we try and figure out how tall something looks or how high the light is. All right, so if you move to the right, pretty simple. You know, anywhere in between here, it doesn't have to be 45 degrees. It could be 10 degrees off camera, left or right. You just need to know to tell somebody who's going to set up the lighting that that's what you want. Or they're going to tell you, yeah, we need a 30-degree right off camera light, make it about medium elevation, meaning how high up the light is. Or, you go left. Once you hit about 60 degrees, and this is not a rule, but just kind of a general observation. Once you hit about 60 degrees, people start calling it side light, just because it's more off to the side than it is coming from the front. So side light could go all the way, probably maybe to 100 degrees, a little bit past 90. Anything on a 90-degree angle is going to be pure side light. You're going to split the subject in half. It's going to be half light, half dark. Now, once you get around to it, then we're starting to get into backlight area, or kind of rim light area. Generally, backlight comes from roughly around this area right here. That's usually where it's going to be. And a lot of times if somebody says backlight, they mean they are illuminating the background and not necessarily the subject. Whereas if you've got a rim light, that light could be in the back behind the subject, but it's aimed at the subject, creating that rim of light around them. Does that make sense? Questions? All right, so I recommend download it, keep it as reference for yourself. Draw it if you want to. Good practice. It's always good to kind of visualize an overhead of what your lighting setup is going to be. That way you do a little planning, pre-production, if you will, ahead of time, so you've got a idea of where to start. All right, now, in addition to that, we've also got this lighting guide. It's basically digital camera world. It's a portrait guide. And that link is down under resources right here. So should be able to save the image. I'm just going to save it to my desktop. And, you say to yourself, oh, great, it's unimpressive. But the thing you want to do is go up to view, and I'm in the Mac preview program, go to actual size. So it is a big JPEG. There's plenty of resolution here to be able to use it as reference. So the idea is you're going to find one that's got at least 2 lights in it. Now, for our purposes, we are going to define 2 lights as 1 light, and if there is no second light, a bounce card. And we'll get to why we consider that a light source in a second. But it's got to have at least 2 sources of light. So we've got plenty of examples here. And if you really want to get creative, you've got, lots of light on this last example. This is one of the hardest ones to do if you're just starting out, but seems to be very popular. Actually had some people do a really good job on it. All right, so let me go back to Zoom to Fit so we can talk about what's going on with this. All right, so you notice we've got the portrait guide. We've got a little diagram, a little bit of an explanation underneath from the photographer as to what they did, and we've got the final result of that work. Down at the bottom, we've got a legend of all the tools that were used. And if anybody's interested in lighting more, I recommend finding a good digital photography website, because photographers are really appreciative of people who like their work, and they will be happy to tell you how they did it most of the time. Photographers put up tutorials all the time. Now, if there's something very specific to a style of photographer, they may not reveal that, but they'll probably at least reveal what kind of camera they used, what kind of lens they used, they may give you a general idea of the lighting. Some of the really interesting pictures you see is a result of, the camera shutter remaining open in a completely darkened room, and a photographer will come around and walk around with light. You've all seen those. They look like swirls of light through an image. It looks really cool. Takes a long time to do, and you really have to know what you're doing and plan ahead a lot. But just general photography, basic lighting, it is one of the better resources that you can find on the internet. So digital photography websites, highly recommend them if you're interested in lighting. So let's take a look at what's going on with this. And let's go actual size. And how wide can we make it? Wide enough. All right, so a couple of these, like the first three, we don't really have to worry about a whole lot. Camera, we got a camera in mind, right? We set the focal length. Now, the focal length here is probably a 50, since it's a portrait, it's probably a 50 millimeter lens, which is exactly what we have set up for you guys in the portrait scene. We've got the camera, we've got the bookmark for the camera or the camera angle kind of locked in. So it's all set up. Model, it's going to be whatever you're taking a picture of. Background, we supplied the background for you. Now with the portrait, everything comes with materials on it already, because we created a subsurface scattering material out of the AI standard material. And since we're not doing materials, it's pre-assigned. It's even got the texture on it. So this is going to be an example of, if you don't set your project correctly, that texture will be missing when you render, and your model will look like a dead corpse because it will just be all waxy and white. All right, so now let's get in and talk a little bit about what these lights are and what they do. So a lot of times in studio photography, you run across at least one, if not more, versions of the light they use. One is going to be what's called a fixed light, meaning it's off and on with a light switch. You turn it on, it stays on until you turn the light switch off. The other one is going to be a strobe, or sometimes called a flash. Flash photography, a flash on your phone you guys are familiar with, but technically it is called a strobe. Now, the difference between the two is when the light stays on, light also usually generates heat. In the old days before, fluorescent lights and LEDs, halogens and incandescent lights were used, and they get hot quickly. So Photographers were very early to adapt strobes in a studio setting to try and keep the heat down. It's also really beneficial if you're trying to photograph food. You put some food under a hot light all the time and it gets really nasty quick. That's why one of the things about photographing food is you can't believe what you see in a photograph or on TV because it's probably not the real product. They do all kinds of stuff to enhance it. The stuff they put on top of burgers to make them look juicy and slick, it's either Vaseline or it's going to be glycerin of some kind on there. All that syrup you see being poured slowly with that beautiful amber color, that's usually motor oil. So the stuff you see is generally not even close to being food. A lot of times you see the little sizzly parts on the grill, that's all generated with some really nasty fat, or they just wind up spraying it in from behind or the sides. So strobe photography is basically battery-powered lights that go off when the photographer clicks the shutter button on the camera. They will usually stay on as long as the camera shutter is open to let light in. Now, the real difference is strobes generally go off a split second before the camera opens. So you avoid things like red eye, and you also avoid, just seeing that flash show up immediately. So you want the light on, the camera shutter to open, the camera shutter closes, light goes off. And that's usually how it works. Now, in the world of photography and film and TV and video shooting, you generally roll with lights that can do more than one thing, which is why we have spotlights, and we also have hoods or, pieces of diffuser we put over the lights to get basically two different looks for the price of one piece of equipment. Remember, usually in production, everything's got to multitask, including us. So let's talk about what these types of lights are and how we would relate them to CG and what we have. So a strobe with a reflector. The reflector is the shiny cone part on the sides. Think of it like the reflector inside a flashlight or car headlights. Generally nowadays, you just replace the light bulb in your car, and there's a reflector inside that takes that light and shoots it out the front. And then there's what they call a Fresnel lens in front of the headlight, which kind of diffuses it a little bit, but not a lot. It still keeps it, a really good spread. So strobe with a reflector, what would this be for us in CG? Yeah, would be a spotlight. So one of the most utilitarian lights that we have, a spotlight, used for lots of stuff. Not everything, but a lot. All right. So strobe with a honeycomb. So spotlight, since it says strobe, what do you think that honeycomb attachment in front of the light is doing? Yeah, dispersing it a little bit, not a lot. Its job is to basically act like a minimal diffuser. I really don't want to use that word. It just kind of breaks up the light enough so the edges are not razor sharp of your shadows. They're softened a little bit. So how do we soften the shadows in a spotlight? Yeah. Intensity is only going to be how bright it is. Okay, the radius of it. And that's down under the Arnold section of the spotlight. Remember, that light and the point light are basically the same light, an infinitely small point in space. The difference between the two, spotlight's got a cone. The point light shines light in all directions. So this would be with adjusted radius, which gives it a physical size. Does that make sense? Questions? Anybody? All right, so now we have a strobe with a snoot. Kind of sounds like a South Park term. So strobe still says spotlight. What do you think that snoot is doing? Yeah. Say it again. Focusing the light. What do you mean by focus? Okay, forcing it in a certain direction. And also, notice that there are rings there. And each set of rings makes that light area smaller. So they're adjustable. Usually you unscrew the rings you don't want. You put in more rings to make that light focus, or the area get smaller. What do we do in CG? Yep, it's called, cone size, or in Maya, it's cone angle. Because by default, you get a 40-degree cone angle in Maya, which is sort of like this. You know, you get like 45, and then you might get 90. My finger can't go anymore, but you get the idea. The bigger the cone, the bigger the area that spotlight will illuminate. And basically, it's going to be the size of that ring or the size of that area of light. It's usually a circle or an ellipse. So we adjust the cone angle. Now we come across a strobe with a softbox. And here's where we diverge from using the same light. That softbox is actually equivalent to a very specific light type. Area light, yeah. It's a big, broad surface of light. So the job of that diffuser is to not only make the light break up, but it's also to increase the surface area that is sending out light rays. So it makes it like a big, broad surface of light, equivalent to light pouring in through a window or a door being open. So here in Full Sail, I mean, our room, we've got portals in each door. We've got a square, or we've got a rectangular shape on either side of the door. We've got a big oval, kind of like porthole in the side of the wall. All those would be really good uses for area lights to bring light into the room. And that's why if we turn off all the light in this room, it would not be totally dark. We would still have some light streaming in from the hallway out there. So this would be not just an area light, but this would be our Arnold, our AI area light, which is a lot more physically accurate than a Maya light. That Maya light is basically, it's okay, but it's not going to give you the subtleties and shape and look of the Arnold. All right, now, here we get into indirect light. So this is all direct light. So indirect light, we've got silver reflector, shoot-through white Brawley, and a silver Brawley. They are all means to create indirect light. Now, unlike the real world, we do not get a one-to-one transfer of energy. So for example, we have a lot of light bouncing around this room because a lot of our ceiling lights are hitting the walls and they're bouncing around here. Right? In CG, we would not get that much light. Our indirect lighting systems, I don't care which one you're using, is not going to give you the same look as the real world, not for quite a while. You know, there are really good lighting systems, but you're always going to wind up needing more light, just the way it is. Now, instead of us trying to calculate indirect light by having a reflector, and we're not going to get as much energy as we would in the real world from all the lights that we have around, we wind up using an additional light to replace the reflectors. So when you see a reflector or a bounce card or a shoot-through Brawley, always think to yourself, additional light. Now, the type of additional light you get is going to be based on what the material is. So for instance, that silver reflector is going to be a lot more smooth than the silver Brawley or the shoot-through Brawley. It's not going to diffuse the light as much. It's going to diffuse it, but that will provide probably a little more of a harsher indirect light. Kind of similar to you taking a mirror outside, or, you know, those car shades that you have that are Mylar, that kind of foil coat. It looks like foil and, you know, reflecting sunlight onto somebody else. It's going to be similar to that. So what kind of lights would we use in CG to get the quality of these lights? So for example, silver reflector, what could we use? Directional light is only used for sun. We don't ever use it inside, for example, unless you are actually trying to mimic the sun and you've got special lights. Yes. Say again? Area light, yep. And based on the shape of it, you could take our Arnold AI area light and change it from a quad to what? A disc. Remember, we've got that option. So we could use an area light. That would be my first go-to. And I usually base my light type on what's shown in either the reference or in the diagram by the photographer. If they're using a square shape, they've probably done that for a reason over a round shape. In this case, they're using a round shape, and that's probably done very, you know, consciously. They're not going to make a mistake and change reflectors on you. The shape of it probably matters. Now, in reality, you could probably get away with a quad area light. The changes are a little subtle in the light pattern, but you could probably get away with it. Disc shape, maybe area, or maybe quad. Anything else? Well, technically, you could probably use a point light, but what do you have to worry about with a point light? the light going everywhere. So sometimes that's an issue where you don't want to have any light behind the bounce card. If it's not an issue, you might be able to get away with a point light. But the problem is with that bounce card, you're holding it in a certain position and you are directing the light. With that point light, you're still run the risk of it just spreading out too much. Possible, but not necessarily guaranteed result. Yeah, you might be able to do something like a spotlight, because the spotlight, we can at least adjust the cone. We can also make the edge soft if we need it. But the downside of that is it's still a direct light. It's not really diffused a lot. So if this, and usually most of the time people use reflectors or bounce cards for fill light is so they don't really get additional noticeable shadows. And one of the issues you might have with a spotlight is another noticeable shadow. Whereas with a bounce card or a reflector, it's going to be a lot softer because the light's going to be softer. So your shadows are going to be really soft. It is possible, though. You could get away with it. All right, so now we come to shoot through white Brawley. And shoot through white Brawley is kind of unique. So here's an example of what it does. I really hate to get rid of all that, but. All right, so if anybody wants a picture of this, take it, because I'm about to destroy it. We'll come back and talk about the indirect light again. All right. So for this, it can do two things. You can let light go through it. It will diffuse the light, sort of like a softbox. And then it will also reflect light off of the back side. Now, when you get into inexpensive light kits in photography, instead of a softbox, you usually get what they call shoot-through Brawley, because they're a lot cheaper. And what you wind up doing is you get 2 for 1. You've got the ability to shoot through and have it diffuse, just like a softbox, but then you've got the ability to flip it around so light bounces off of that. It's an umbrella, basically, that round, semi-spherical hemisphere shape, and it bounces back onto the subject. So you get it as a bounce card. You also get it as a diffuser. Which one you want usually lets a little more light through in the front than it does bouncing off the back. But this single light can illuminate both sides. It can be bounced back and it can let light through. Here's one of the things that you have to know about this if you're trying to mimic it and you've got a situation like this. You've got areas right here where it's strongest, and you've got a little bit of a shadow or a void in the middle. Sometimes that is very noticeable when you're trying to apply correct lighting. So you have to be aware that, for example, if you've got somebody who's being illuminated or a subject being illuminated from the center of a shoot through, that they're going to have a little bit of shadow in the middle and it's going to be kind of brighter on the edges. It's going to look like light is passing through a tree limb or something like that. Now, what could we use for this light? And don't be stuck thinking, oh, I have to only use one light. Point light, maybe, but the trouble with the point light is you're not going to get this little bit of shadowy area in the middle, which might be crucial. Spotlight, all right, which one? Which direction? So in this area over here? All right, so we get to a spotlight. Yep, that might make sense. Get a big enough cone there, make the edges of the cone nice and soft. All right, how about over on the left side? Yep, maybe an area. How about two areas back to back? Two spotlights back to back, or two spotlights off to the side. Now here, possibly 2 point lights. Put a little point light here. Little point light over here. You know, far enough away from each other so they kind of decay by the time they get together. You might be able to get that look. So area, two areas, two spots, maybe a couple of point lights, maybe one of each. It really depends on what works. Honestly, my go-to for this would probably be, I would start off with two area lights. Just because it's a round shape, I could go with two discs back to back. Now, if the shot calls for light not to be visible from the back of it, then I can get away with just a single spot, a single area light. It depends on how it's being used. Does that make sense? Questions? All right. About Zoom, anybody got any questions? Julio, questions? And here we are. All right, so now the difference between a shoot-through brolly and a silver brolly is with a silver brolly, it's got a black backing on it, so no light gets through, it only reflects. So it's kind of like having half of a white shoot-through brolly. Although the one thing that you really need to take note of, they call it a silver brolly because it's got silver flecks inside the material, which help it to reflect. That silver is also going to make the light appear cooler than when light bounces off a piece of fabric. So we're going to notice some actual color temperature differences when we look at the images. So for this, we could get away with what kind of light? Yeah, get away with an area light, possibly a spotlight, but again, you got to watch if they're using a silver brolly, it's going to be a reflector. It's going to be diffused a lot more than a spotlight. Just remember, a spotlight's going to be more direct light. The shadows are going to be harder by default. Area light, based on its physical size, is going to have softer shadows. All right, let me see if I can shrink this down a little. All right, so the first 4 shots across the top all have the light in exactly the same position. The difference is the type of light they're using. Another difference is going to be the material that the light either goes through or bounces off of. Now, this is called a Rembrandt because after the painter, Rembrandt was considered to be a master of using light in traditional fine art. He used to sit his subjects near a big open window and, make sure it was the right time of the day. And that's kind of how he painted. He used that as a big, giant area light. And then they put mirrors on the other side so they could bounce a little bit of light if they needed it in there. But it was really the start of photography. Now, this traditional Rembrandt, you'll notice that we've got, a good 2/3 of the head being illuminated. And then we've got this area right here that makes the eye visible. So that eye is not completely in shadow. And that's due in part to the fact that the bridge of the nose goes in and allows light to shoot across it. Now, something else you want to look at when you are trying to study a portrait and figure out where things are. Go back to actual size. Where are we? Here we are. So use the landmarks that are built into the head. You've got the nose, which provides shadow. You've also got the eyes, which provide location for the light. So here we can see the light is about 45 degrees left, right? That's pretty simple. You can just see that based on that little lighting compass we just did. Here, here, and we got our light coming here. So that's roughly about 45 degrees. Now, we can establish that. That's great. But that doesn't tell us where the light is as far as what we call elevation. How high up is the light? We can get that from a couple of markers on the face. One is the nose. If the shadow goes straight across the face, the light is even with the head. If the shadow from the nose goes up, that means the light is lower. Remember, light is always 180 degrees away from, or shadow is 180 degrees away from the light. So in this case, we've got a couple of markers. We've got a nose shadow, which kind of points down a little bit. And we've also got the highlight in the eye, which is roughly right above that kind of center point in the eye, the horizon line of the eye, slightly above. So now we can figure out, okay, we got light 45 degrees left. It's slightly elevated above center line of the head, and we're going for that nose shadow. Now, if the shadow is too long, the light's too far around to the side. If the nose shadow is too short, the light's too close to the front of the face. But here we've got the rotation right here. That kind of helps us out a lot. Does that make sense? So these are your landmarks to look for when you're trying to do basically anything. Always look for, if the shadows are super short, the light's probably pretty high. The shadows are super long, the light's probably pretty low. And then if it's got some kind of highlight or, other marker, like something shiny, like a mug that would have a highlight in it from a light source, you can probably tell where that light is based on the position. All right, so this is softbox. This would be basically an area light. So now next to it, we've got Rembrandt through a Brawley. So this is like taking the softbox, but it's got curvature to it. So what is that curvature doing? Well, for one thing, it's providing just a little more light around the side of the head here. Notice that the side of the head and the ear is a little more noticeable than it is in the traditional flat softbox. The background is just slightly brighter. Shadows, they're roughly in the same position. You can see the highlight in the eyes roughly the same. The shadow under the chin and the neck is roughly the same, but just a little more light kind of sneaking around to the side because of the way that brolly curves. All right, so the next one, light is in exactly the same position, but now we've got a direct light. We've got a spotlight. Now, the spotlight has a honeycomb on it, and you can see that it didn't, it makes the shadows a little bit soft on the edges. They're not nearly as soft as they are with the softbox and the brolly. Notice also the light is more focused on the head, very little of it getting around to the backdrop. This would be like pretty much a film noir shot. Very distinct light and dark areas. Now I got a little bit of light back here that's kind of bleeding around the subject, but not much. Now here, we've taken a silver brolly. Basically, this is all reflected light. And notice how different the skin looks. Now we've got a fair model, meaning the skin is very fair. And when you add silver to it, you are basically kind of bleaching that light a little bit more, and you're making that scene almost look cold. A lot of times if they want you to see, desperation or, resignation, something to be bleak, they will usually take a picture with some kind of filter to really enhance that mood. Right, so you can see, this shoot-through brolly looks a little bit warmer. Looks a little bit warmer than the silver. All right, questions? Does that make sense? So light's in the same position. All we've done is change the type of light we're using on the subject. All right, so now we've got a Rembrandt short. It's basically the subject's head is turned mostly away from the camera. The part that's turned away gets illuminated. So that's the short part. And then the broad side is mostly in shadow. Light looks like it's more or less in the same position. You can see it's slightly above. That nose shadow is probably almost the same, almost like an over-the-shoulder shot. Now abroad, take the light, move it to the other side now. The side that is turned away from the camera is dark, so it's a short side. The broad side's got the illumination, and that's how the name comes. And here you've got direct side light, a split right down the middle. Now, fortunately, enough light sneaks around the back of the subject, so the backdrop is not completely dark, but very stark photo. Now, this next one, this would be the first one that you would be allowed to be allowed to pick to use for your portrait, because technically it's got two lights in it. It's got a key light. Which one's the key? Yep. So this would be your key. And then this would be your fill. And notice that they've got it back far enough where it's not picking up all that much energy. It is kicking back some light, but it's not enough to create another shadow. So this is basically a split, again, off to the side, but it's got a fill on the other side. All right, split short, side light again, head turned away, split broad. Again, a little bit different. You're trying to get more shadow on the short side. So key with a close softbox. All right, so what do we notice about this one as far as where the light's positioned? Super close. It's off to the side, so it's about 45 degrees on the right. Anything else? Yeah, near the camera. How about elevation wise? How high up is the light? Well, how high up though? Well, yeah, you can. Take a look at the eyes. Take a look at the nose shadow. Yeah, it's pretty much level with their face. So the two things that tell us that it's level with their face is this shadow from the nose goes almost perfectly to the side. Now, it's a very short shadow, so that means it's pretty close to being in front of the face. And take a look at the highlight in the eyes. That highlight goes like right through the center line of the eye. So that tells you that light is pretty much level with the head. The fact that it's close, the fact that it's coming from the front, that gives it that short shadow. Does that make sense? All right, so here, key with a faraway softbox, it's basically in the same position, but they pulled it back. So you pull it back, now the head is not, taking up all the light, if you will. A lot of that light is now spreading around the side to the back of the subject. You can see, has the elevation changed on this? What's that? Yeah, it does look a little higher. Looks like the light is still sort of close, but if you take a look at the highlight in the eye on the key with a closed softbox and over here with the far away, it does look like it's slightly higher. What's that? Yeah, it does. Slightly above, not as much as the others, but slightly above. We got a little bit of a nose shadow, but not that much. Yeah. Yeah, she has. She looks like she's actually either leaning back or they've moved the camera back just a little bit. Yeah, you're right. Kind of looks like she leaned back and twisted her shoulders up. It looks very uncomfortable. Honestly, if they're going to have her like that, they wouldn't have her stand, they'd have her sit. Because it's a lot easier to maintain a stationary position while you're sitting than if you're standing. No matter how much you try not to move, you're still going to wobble a little. All right, so a loop, similar to the Rembrandt, but rather than creating that closed triangle of light on the unlit cheek, you basically get the nose shadow not quite as long and sort of pointing down in the same direction, but this is open now. So lights off to the side, that's probably closer to 30 degrees than it is 45, right? Still above a little bit and almost level with the camera. So the butterfly, this one is basically front light, completely front light. Raised up just a little bit, goes up the center line of the eye, got a little bit of shadow under the nose coming straight down. Yeah, well, also the head's probably picked up a little more than down, like compare that to the shot next to it, the flat where the head's kind of aimed down, looking up. Yeah, definitely.
The men find out that we can shapeshift, they will go tell the church. Like because of the way light, like the way light can affect how a person's face when you
right.
like, change the position, and it was just really, it was like, yeah.
All right, so flat light, this would actually be one that you could use. It's got two lights. This is basically two key lights. Key light left, key light right. Looks like they're almost level with the head. It says at head height, so there's a dead giveaway there. Flat light, this is when you're trying to show everything and not have it be unflattering. This is good if you're doing a headshot, you want to send it in because they're looking for a certain type of actor or a certain look for either, stage production, theater, whatever it happens to be. Yep. Tilt it down. So now this next one, the Badger, it's basically taking the flat light, flip it around to the back, and now you've got Wolverine. So notice you've got that V of shadow in the center of the head. This is a very popular one to try. Now, a couple of things about this, just from having seen it been done before in many other classes. A lot of times people will get the idea that I've positioned my lights in my scene exactly the way they are in the diagram, but I'm not getting the results. Well, remember, we're doing CG lights. That's a diagram. That's what the photograph looks like. What you want to do is, just because you put your lights back there, think of it as a starting point. You want to move your lights around to the front until you start to get the result that you see in your reference. Right? So the reference is reference, but you still want your render to look like the reference. So we've got the diagram reference and we've also got the photo. You start with the diagram, set your scene up, but then when you start rendering, you're basically looking at the photo to try and get that light. Also, one of the big issues we have is that there's way too much shadow under the neck. So you want to make sure, if you need it, to add in some extra lights. Just because the photographer shows two lights, he got that in the real world. Doesn't mean we will get that in CG. So we might need to add an extra light, maybe underneath just a little bit to take some of the shadow off the bottom of the face and underneath. Clamshell, basically similar to the butterfly, but it's a light above and a light below. So now we get into like more traditional photographic lighting that you see a lot, you know, not like high school picture or something like that, but it's a very standard look. You've got a key light off to the left. It's very similar to the original Rembrandt position, not quite. It's a little bit more like 30, 35 degrees. Well, yeah, it's meant to look good to the camera, not whether it's comfortable for the model. And that's why, you know, they usually make pretty good money because you got to stay in that position. All right. So loop or Rembrandt setup, like I said, key light left. We add a background light. This would be a traditional backlight. That light is aimed at the backdrop. So we can figure out the key light, no problem, right? Look at the nose shadow, look at the highlight in the eye. Where is that backlight? We know it's right behind the subject, but how high up is it? Yeah, it's behind the neck, right around the base of the shoulders or the top of the shoulders, somewhere in there. So we got that nice gradient. Now, this might be a really good use for you to add some color in your light to get that kind of steely blue background, because you might need to add some color in there, because the photographer started with a white background, but based on the shadow, based on the light type, the color temperature of the light, the color, color temperature of the background, it comes out looking kind of like dark gray blue. Now, the next shot, same key light exactly, backlight flipped around, and now it is being used as a rim light. What do you notice about the rim light, though, looking at the actual photo and compare it with the diagram? Say again? Okay, so yep, that's exactly what you want from a rim. But how about visually, the position of it in the diagram versus what you're seeing? Yeah, I agree. Because that diagram looks like it's almost directly behind the head. But in reality, we're seeing it dominate our right side, the model's left side. So little things like that. Remember, go by what the photograph shows you. Try and like unthink what you expect to see with it. Just because that diagram shows it in the middle, the reality is it's off to the right a little bit. So they got a honeycomb grid or a snoot attached. Again, that's just to kind of confine the shape of the light off to the side of the head. All right, so now we've basically got the same shot, loop with a background light, but now we've added in another light. So high key simply means there's very little shadow. Everything is illuminated. So key light still to the left, that backlight is taking care of the background. And then we've got that silver reflector off to the right, filling in the rest of the light. Right, key and fill. So basically 45 left, pretty much almost like the Rembrandt setup. And then you've got a fill light off to the right. You can see, if you take a look at the eyes, right, there's your fill. There's your key. Key is elevated slightly. The fill light looks like it's a little lower than even with the head. And they've reduced its power to roughly half of the key light. So like I said, fill light, key light, there's your good starting balance. Now, whether you get that in the real world or in CG, that's another question. Remember, you're going by what it looks like in your render. All right, so we've got the same setup here, key and fill, this time with a hair light. This is also called a kick light. We're just trying to accent part of the hair. All right, hard key with kickers. Notice anything about this? Does this look familiar at all? Yep, it's exactly the Badger, but with a hard key light. And notice that hard key light, that's a pretty hard edge on the shadow there. So they're not saying whether they put a honeycomb in it or not, but that would be up to you to figure out. Just adjust the angle, or I'm sorry, the radius for the shadows to soften up a little. And then we get here. Colored gels. Very circusy. All right, so key light, which one's the key? Yep, I would agree. This one right here. That'd be your key. You can see there's the highlight in the eye up there. It's raised slightly above. So there's the key. What's going on over here? The red one? Yeah, it sort of looks like a split. It's a little bit back, but since the other one we've kind of identified as the main light source, that's really going to be sort of like a fill. So that's going to be kind of your red fill off to the side here. And it goes pretty far around to the front of the head. Now it's kind of aimed in the back, so it doesn't creep around too much to the front. All right, so now we've got this one. Go ahead, Nelson, you got it. Which one's that? Yep, that's the backlight. So that one's blue. So we got a red fill. We got a blue back. And now we got this little purpley magenta light. Yep. So technically, if it's going to outline, what do we call it? Yeah, that's going to be our rim. All right, so we've identified all the main parts, and you would start this by just worrying about the key light first. Then try the fill light. Backlight, put the rim light in. Last but not least, this bounce right here. Anybody want to know? Tell me what that's doing. What do you think it's doing? Giving more of a highlight, yeah. Sort of, yeah. So it's actually not really a secondary fill. I would say it's kind of helping out the key light. And really what it's really helping to do is to keep some of that red light from the fill light bleeding around too far to the front, and some of that pink rim light from bleeding around too far to the front also. So it's really kind of helping to neutralize those colored lights, so it keeps them in check. So it's really just kind of a like photographer got it. Looks like a photographer got all done and went, you know what? I got too much pink light bleeding over, and maybe a little too much red light. Come over here with the bounce card. So they come over with the reflector, and then that kind of just washes it out a little bit. And notice they don't have it aimed at the face. They have it kind of aimed away so they can keep that light not from going in this direction, kind of washing out all the other lights. So like I said, this is one of the harder ones to do. So if you choose to do it, give yourself enough time to play around with it. All right, does that kind of make sense going through that? Now, generally, this is how you would approach any, multiple light setup. Establish where's the key light first. What can I see based on that key light where the shadows go? All right, let's minimize that. All right, so as I mentioned about elevation, shadows too long, lights too low. Also, if you start to see a hot spot in the background or the ground plane or the subject, that means the light is too close. Now, if the hot spot's visible in the reference, great. You want to try and do that. Now, if the shadows are too short, the light is usually too high. All right, so we talked a little bit about this. It's a good time to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about light linking, and we'll get into doing some demos and talk about what you guys are going to work on today. Questions? Everybody good?
Good.
All right, thank you. So let's take a short break, and let's come back at 3:55. All right, so as usual, I have to end the session so I can record, or I can render out the first part of lecture, and then we'll get started.
You said 3:55?
Correct, 3:55.